The year is 2006. January 2006 to be specific, and the Xbox 360 has successfully launched in North America, and, well, it sure did launch in Japan. Despite all of the intense buzz generated by Microsoft after announcing a slate of Japanese developed titles for the platform in the months leading up to the launch of the 360, and years worth of intense marketing and hype at big shows such as E3 and Tokyo Game Show, this wondrous white box flopped on the deck almost immediately in Japan, sitting firmly at the bottom of the sales chart heading into January 06, with only sales of the original Xbox sitting beneath it, which isn't terribly surprising. Among many of the articles written on the failure of the Japanese launch of the Xbox 360, there appears to be an agreed upon consensus. There just weren't enough Japanese games at the launch of the console, and many of these articles cited the slight delays of Tecmo's Dead or Alive 4 and FromSoftware's Enchanted Arms, which forced them to slip out of their December launch in order to finalize testing and polishing these respective titles for a late December release for Dead or Alive 4 and an early January release for Enchanted Arms, respectively. And while Dead or Alive 4 is an excellent 3D fighting game with tight controls, satisfyingly complex gameplay, and great graphics, only one of these is a JRPG. And thus, today, we turn our critical lens to FromSoftware's Enchanted Arms. Proudly touted as the first Japanese role-playing game for the Xbox 360 by the press and its Western publisher Ubisoft, Enchanted Arms is a perhaps not-so-remarkable JRPG with kind of an enchantingly plain story behind both its development and its positioning in the Xbox 360 library. In order to better understand FromSoftware's relationship with the Xbox 360, however, we ought to start our journey way back in the ancient times of 2002. Fresh off of a similarly lukewarm launch for its comically large Xbox console, Microsoft set out on a grand initiative to build goodwill between Japanese consumers and their fledgling young Xbox brand. Sound familiar? To do this, they spent a considerable amount of time and money courting Japanese developers so that they would work on games for the platform and help them wedge their hulking monster of a console into the consumer market already dominated by Nintendo, Sony, and the then exiting Sega. In doing so, a number of developers and publishers stepped up to the plate, including the likes of Tecmo, Capcom, and our focal point for today's video, FromSoftware. It's important to note that at this point, the FromSoftware that existed is not the world-renowned developer that it is today. They were best known for their long-running Armored Core franchise on the PlayStation platform, as well as their long-running King's Field franchise and a few other scattered titles published in the Japanese market throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Their games were successful, but perhaps not quite the juggernauts that their releases are today, which frames their decision to get into bed with Microsoft's brand new Xbox platform all the more surprising. Without a pre-established market to sell to for that platform, they were truly shooting in the dark here, and with what I can only assume was aggressive Microsoft support, managed to land a few shots here, with two titles, Murakumo Renegade Mech Pursuit and Otogi Myth of Demons, being released within the first year of the console's availability in Japan, and two more Otogi 2, Immortal Warriors, and Metal Wolf Chaos launching on the platform in 2003 and 2004 respectively. And while none of these games made huge waves or cemented the Xbox as a titan of game enjoyment in Japan, their willingness to support the platform with highly creative, critically well-received titles should not and cannot be overlooked in the path from these titles to the development of Enchanted Arms for the Xbox 360. Another thing worth noting before we sit down and take a big old bite out of Enchanted Arms is that 3 of these 4 titles were produced by longtime FromSoftware producer and story writer Masanori Takeuchi, with the exception being Murakumo, which was produced by Akinori Kaneko. And while this was the only one of the 4 not produced by Takeuchi, he did direct that game. So, it comes with little surprise then that the Enchanted Arms project would also end up falling under the production of Takeuchi, whose fondness for the Xbox could potentially be inferred based on his intimate familiarity with the Xbox across those 4 console titles. And that would put him at an advantage when navigating the uncharted waters of the then up-and-coming Xbox follow-up platform. It makes sense that there'd be some similarities, if not between the hardware, than with the software for the platform, right? The real surprise, however, is that this new title, which was announced to be in development as early as July of 2005, would not fall in line with any of the previous Xbox titles that Takeuchi and the team at FromSoftware had produced. Those games were action titles in which you roamed around large environments and directly engaged with the enemies you came across in spectacular style. Instead, this would be FromSoftware's first, and so far only attempt to bring a traditional turn-based Japanese role-playing game to the Xbox market. In fact, looking at their complete list of games, it might be their only traditional turn-based role-playing game effort to date as a studio. So, we have a seasoned producer leading a team that we can assume is familiar with the ins and outs of the original Xbox hardware. They're transitioning into a new platform, working in one of the most treasured and established genres of Japanese games, the turn-based role-playing game, and they don't have any previous history with the genre themselves. What could possibly go wrong is a question I would love to ask if it appeared that something had gone wrong during the process of this game's development. It appears that, unlike many of the games that video essayists such as myself like to cover, Enchanted Arms was put together by a team of experienced, efficient developers. The game was announced in mid-2005 to launch alongside the Xbox 360 in Japan for its December 2005 launch, and it was already 40% complete as of July of 2005, which indicated that the pace of development was brisk, but doable for this team considering the pace of other FromSoftware projects of that era. They were also given extensive software support directly from Microsoft, as well as early development hardware for the console to help keep things smooth while things shifted in different directions as Microsoft finished the console themselves. Unlike our first episode on Lost Odyssey, where the team had to deal with a constantly changing development environment due to the volatility of the Unreal Engine and cooperation between different studios, FromSoftware was able to announce the game, release it less than a year after its initial announcement, and release it with minimal issues. There's something to be said about working with an experienced team under a single studio in terms of getting a piece of software such as this up and running effectively. The team even got to experiment with some of the new hardware capabilities of the Xbox 360, which allowed them to create a full 720p HD resolution game with minimal loading screens due to the Xbox 360's improved caching between the hard drive and the disk. The only caveat that the team expressed regarding Microsoft's hardware was their choice of using DVDs as the storage format for the console, versus siding with like the then up-and-coming HD DVD or the Blu-ray disc. Producer Takeuchi was worried initially that the game would be forced to ship on 2 or even 3 discs. Ultimately, this was not the case. The game was eventually shipped for the Xbox 360 platform on a single dual-layer DVD. The game was delayed once from December 10th, 2005 to January 12th of 2006, and that forced it to miss the launch window of the Xbox 360, but it was necessary to allow the team additional time to polish the game. It hit its new release date without further issue, and in May of 2006, it was announced that Ubisoft, who had previously published Murakumo for the original Xbox, would be picking the game up and localizing it and publishing it for Western audiences. This, too, was a fast and efficient process. It was picked up in May, shown at E3 2006 with a few trailers in English, and then shipped to North American audiences in late August, and to Europe and Australia in September, complete with a full English translation and voice dub. The whole project, hyped up as the first JRPG on the Xbox 360, was announced, finished, and localized in English just slightly over a year after its 2005 unveiling. So, then the real question is how is it? Man, I did not love this game, which, considering all of the talent behind it, is more than a little surprising. I mean, you've got a producer that put out not one, but 2 excellent Otogi titles, and produced the deliciously silly Metal Wolf Chaos, a game director that literally led the design team for Metal Wolf Chaos, and a team filled with King's Field and Armored Core veterans. What could possibly go wrong? Wait. None of those were traditional turn-based role-playing games. Enchanted Arms is a traditional role-playing game centered around the journey that a young man named Atsuma must take in order to, as one does, save the entire planet from devastation. You see, 1,000 years before the events of the game, a massive war was fought between mechanical creatures known as golems, which were built to serve humans, but later decided they wanted to have a good time free of the demands of their creators. In doing so, they basically managed to destroy the world, forcing the ancient predecessors of our modern characters to seal them away. Unfortunately, for our lead, who was born with a mysteriously enchanted right arm, he and his high school magic studying buddies, Toya and Makoto, while wandering one day in search of Atsuma's beloved dog, accidentally unseal one of the legendary devil golems, the Ice Queen. This, understandably, does not end well for Atsuma and company. He's forced to reckon with the dire consequences of his perceived as reckless behavior, which includes the destruction of his hometown and the death of nearly everyone he's ever known, which sets him out on a globe-trotting adventure to stop the Ice Queen, save the planet, and discover just what the deal is with his enchanted arm. Over the course of this 35-hour minimum quest, Atsuma is joined by a colorful cast of characters, including a princess and her loyal knight, and a cowgirl who they all accompany him on his journey to save the world and demonstrate the true power of friendship. Jesus Christ. Just rewind and listen to that premise again. Our lead accidentally triggers a world-ending event while chasing after his dog. One of the writers of this scenario, Katsuhiro Hamatani, would later go on to be lead game designer of Bloodborne and co-director of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Having played basically none of either of those games, I can only hope that their premise is substantially more fleshed out considering their respective pedigrees. And with a scenario like that, it's too bad that the other aspects of the world aren't that much more interesting to help flesh out that journey. The game world is spread across a series of mostly empty environments such as a forest, marsh, or desert, with a major city or settlement of sorts punctuating each environment when it's most appropriate for you to finally move on with the story. The game's cities are these largely drab blobs of sorts, such as London City and Kyoto City, and are sparsely packed with very little to do in any of them other than break boxes, open a few chests, and learn some really uninteresting stuff from the people who live in some of these buildings. I guess London City has a casino, but with the fate of the world at stake, who has time to gamble? And if that wasn't enough, you're then forced to grapple with some of the most grating, puddle-deep characters I've ever come across in a traditional role-playing game. Not every JRPG has to bring to the table a character who's experiencing the pain of living 1,000 years, but please, please, please give me something more than a main character who is always described from the beginning to the end of the game as really, really stupid. Seriously, this happens all the time. Atsuma's main character trait is just, I am dumb. Oh well. Other characters, such as the golem hunting cowgirl Yuki, are presented with singular traits of a similar quality. Hers is, I want to be famous and also love money. And while there's a little more nuance as you play through the game, for the most part, that's the only level of depth that her and every other single character gets. It's amusing for the first maybe 4 or 5 hours, grating after about 10, and by the time I hit the credits at 33 hours or so, I wanted every character in the game to do one of two things: die, or find some new hobbies and reflect on their personal inadequacies.
I got neither.
In a genre that lives and dies on the strengths of the characters that you have to basically interact and live with for anywhere from 30 to 100 plus hours, phoning it in like this is just painful. I haven't unilaterally disliked every character in a game like this in a really long time. Good lord, that was a tedious world to inhabit. And yet, somehow, this makes sense to me. After all, what is FromSoftware known for today? Their incredible atmospheric storytelling chops. And even in 2006, their strongest titles such as Kingsfield, Armored Core, and various others didn't really feature traditionally presented narratives such as these. So that this game has such clownishly bad writing and characters almost makes sense to me in a way. But I know what you're thinking. We get it. The characters, they smell bad or whatever, and the world isn't very much fun to prance around in. So, how's the gameplay?
How's the gameplay?
It's great! And I knew it was going to be great before I put the disc in my Xbox. I've played enough Kingsfield, Armored Core, Otogi, and Metal Wolf Chaos to know well in advance that seeing that FromSoftware logo means there's going to be a lot of good times in there pressing these buttons and moving that analog stick. And I'm talking mostly about the battle system, which is system rich, menu dense, and strikes the perfect balance between being over-designed and satisfying to master and engage with. Don't ask me about traversing the environments. Here's a 20-second montage of weird walking animations and breaking boxes that should tell you all you need to know. The battle system is a delicious distillation of everything I have ever loved about a tactical RPG. The menus, the planning, everything. The premise is simple. You and 3 of your buds are given a 4x3 grid to move around that your characters are locked to. The same goes for your enemies. You then have to engage in a planning phase that is equal parts chess, item management, and skill deployment, the likes of which are fairly varied and interesting over the course of the game. I have to mention chess because for the majority of the game, your characters are locked to limited movement ranges. Your ability to position them not only on the field in the right place, but also in the right order will determine how successful your characters are at dealing damage to opponents, but also being saved from taking damage from those opponents. Character proximity on the field also determines your ability to pull off combos with multiple characters and utilize the cover system, which allows you to place stronger characters in front of weaker ones to absorb damage. There are also super moves, or EX moves, that are executed by using EX points. These are loud, boisterous, graphically wild attacks that deal substantial damage and can often make or break your experiences with some of the later bosses in the game. See what I mean when I say system rich? Outside of the actual combat, you're treated to an amusingly dense set of character progression systems locked within the game's many menus. Each battle you complete earns you a variable amount of SP. This SP can then be used to either level up your character's parameters, such as their hit points or direct and ranged attack modifiers, and also can be used to unlock skills that you acquire from both purchasing them at the game shop and unlocking them at unique scripted moments peppered throughout the story. There's a huge range of flexibility that you can go down with each of the individual characters just by tweaking their parameters. There's also a huge variety of battle skills and passive support skills that you must juggle in order to build the perfect setup for your particular playstyle. You can also create new weapons for each of your characters using collectible items, which will assist you in your journey to do the
big world-saving thing.
It's tastefully complex in that classic FromSoftware way. And if I had to appraise it in the context of their entire canon up to that point, one might even call it simplified. I'm looking at you, Armored Core. There's also a monster collecting element built into the game where you can fight the various golems that you encounter in random battles on the field. These golems appear in an advanced form, and when you defeat them, you are allowed to acquire their core. These cores can then be used to create copies of these golems for your personal use in battle, which is incredibly necessary in the early game, but not so much in the later game when your human characters become substantially more powerful. Each of the collectible golems have their own character levels and acquire SP, which can be used very much like how you use it with your human characters. After a certain point, I found myself generally ignoring these golems the closer I got to the end game. But if you're a compulsory collector when you play your games, there's a ton of variety and nuance to be found here through engaging with this system. The only thing about the gameplay that I forgot to mention is the VP system. Each character in Golem has a limited set of vitality points that does not change as the game progresses. As long as you have vitality points remaining, your character will regenerate to full health after each battle. The more damage you take in battle, the more it drains your vitality points. If you start a battle with 0 vitality points, your character starts with 0 HP and EP in battle, which is punishing. I had to learn the hard way that if you heal in a battle where you start with a VP of 0, all of the healing and regenerating you've done during that battle gets dropped back to 0 after the battle's done. This means that you're at different points in the game forced to sideline characters to allow them to regenerate VP in many of the game's longer dungeons, which can sometimes be tedious depending on how you pick and chose your progression. When you combine all of these crisscrossing systems together, you get a tastefully complex, generally rewarding gameplay experience, though I will say that my patience with it began to run out as I disconnected further and further from the game's story and structure as it dragged on. But that has less to do with the gameplay itself and more with the story and character issues that I've already highlighted. I'll chalk the rest of the game's wonky presentation and perhaps less than impressive graphics up to its quick development time and lack of mature development software, and it isn't a great looking game. It wasn't in 2006, and it isn't in 2021. Simple as that. If I didn't dislike almost every story beat and almost every character in Enchanted Arms, I might be tempted to recommend it on the strengths of its gameplay and RPG mechanics alone. But I'm afraid that I'm still sort of breathing that heavy sigh of relief that began when the credits rolled and that final achievement notification popped across the top of my screen. A sigh of that magnitude simply does not warrant a warm recommendation. And trust me, I didn't even mention the horrifyingly bad stereotype of a gay character that is buried somewhere underneath this pile of otherwise garbage characters in the rest of the game. I'm not sure I could do that without getting audibly frustrated. So just know it's there and brace for the worst. So, it's a middling JRPG with a weak story and great gameplay. This happens sometimes. The real question we want to answer here is, how did it impact the legacy of the Xbox 360? Well, it's no secret that Enchanted Arms was partially held responsible for the Xbox 360's dead of a launch in Japan, which in turn limited the installed console base to sell the game to when it finally did launch in January. In the 6 months following its initial release in Japan, there were only 20,233 copies sold, and it was largely considered to have underperformed. It fared a little bit better in Western markets such as North America and Europe, where it could take advantage of the larger installed base of the console. In those regions, it sold roughly 190,000 copies. It doesn't help that it was received rather tepidly by many of its contemporary critics, which certainly limited its sales potential. Its reviews in print magazines such as Edge Magazine and Game Informer described it as soulless and cliched, and a unique offering for the Xbox 360 owners, but one that's highlights can't match those of the RPGs currently burning brightly on the PS2. Online outlets such as 1UP and GameSpy presented the game as well made, but so blatantly unoriginal to the point where it actually may inspire resentment in players, and a traditional approach that negates its presence as a truly next-gen experience. I think that my favorite review headline from somebody whose name, I believe it was from a GameSpot review, didn't make it into the Wayback Machine archive, describes the game as an often enjoyable role-playing game, but also one that you'll likely forget as soon as you finish it. And I feel like that's the most succinct take I could find that I feel absolutely mirrors my experience with the game. Surely this game did infuriate me and frustrate me, but I won't be angry for too long because by tomorrow I'll have forgotten it. And considering how many more JRPGs I have to play, that's probably a good thing. And as the first real JRPG of this console, this isn't a totally unreasonable place to start. The way this game's development was painted in press interviews and the like was that it was developed quickly, as if FromSoftware was determined to have the first JRPG on the 360 market, and as a result, the final product is a little bit underbaked. The meat of its sandwich is solid, but the bread it's served on tastes like it was baked at 700 degrees using sawdust as a flour substitute. The potential is absolutely there. Members of the Enchanted Arms team would go on to make Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, Resident Evil 6 and 7, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Xenoblade Chronicles X. So I get the impression that it was maybe a bit of a whirlwind of a project. And even though it didn't generate any controversy in its day whatsoever, you can tell that this game was a bit of a raw take on the Japanese role-playing game experience. Critical performance aside, the game did have some legs after its release. It was a blockbuster top 10 rental shortly after its release in North America, and was even a bestseller at retail during the month of its North American release. It later received a port to the PlayStation 3, where it was retitled Enchanted Arms in Japan, and would be the first release of the game to have the full Ubisoft English localization included in the package. This port would have a few additional golems and limited motion control support for the 6-axis controller. Unfortunately for PlayStation fans, it also had some pretty evident performance issues that work against it. This puts the Xbox 360 release firmly in its place as the definitive home of Enchanted Arms. It's even available as a backwards compatible title for the Xbox One and Series consoles, though at the time of the writing of this script, I was unable to successfully launch the game after purchasing it digitally on both my Series S and X consoles, which necessitated a refund and a reversion back to my physical copy of the game. Amusingly, the description Microsoft has up for the game had all sorts of formatting issues when I went to purchase it, and that kind of tells you all you need to know about where the game is held in the eyes of the modern Xbox platform holders. And on that note, we've reached the end of the second episode of this series on the JRPGs of the Xbox 360. With the tedium of Enchanted Arms successfully behind us, it's time to set our eyes on the horizon and figure out what's next. Perhaps something a bit more on a galactic scale. Anyways, thanks for joining me in episode 2 of this series in which we examine the JRPGs that were released on the Xbox 360 and break down each of their roles in the legacy of the console. If you enjoyed this and you're looking forward to seeing more material like it, feel free to like the video and subscribe for future episodes. And of course, leave a comment. I love them comments. Thanks, everybody.